To tell the truth, I spoke to very few friends of Meghan because she put a fatwa on anyone talking to me. The whole description she does of the Portland hospital, the birth, that was completely fabricated.
She was also furious about the whole surrogacy business, not only legally, but morally.
Look, when I first saw these photos, I thought someone was messing with me. Like, this has to be AI generated, right? Because here's the thing, that belly doesn't just look off, it looks like a completely different shade than the rest of her body. And I'm not the only one who noticed.
You know, whoever heard of a baby bump being so variable, and not to mention swinging from side to side?
What started as a few people squinting at red carpet photos has turned into this massive rabbit hole that keeps getting deeper. We're talking timelines that don't match up, stories that shift depending on which interview you're watching, and medical claims that have actual doctors going, "Wait, what?" Listen, this isn't about one strange photo or one slip-up. This is about a pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Real quick, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because what I'm about to show you is wild. We're talking photos that don't make sense, timelines that contradict each other, and accounts that flip every single time she retells them. Smash that like too, because trust me, you're going to want to save this one. Let's dive in. Okay, so let's start with the Albert Hall appearance, because this is where a lot of people first started raising their eyebrows. Meghan shows up to this event, and according to the timeline she was putting out there, she was supposed to be around 8 weeks pregnant. 8 weeks. But when you actually look at those photos, she looks at least 5 months along. Now, I'm not a doctor, but even people who've never been pregnant can spot that something doesn't add up there. The difference between 8 weeks and 5 months, that's massive. We're talking about a belly that shouldn't even really be showing yet versus one that's undeniably there. Think about it for a second. At 8 weeks, most women are barely showing, if at all. Some might have a tiny bump starting, but it's subtle. What we're seeing in those Albert Hall photos, that's not subtle. That's a full-on pregnancy belly that you can't miss. And the internet? Oh, the internet noticed. People started pulling up photos from that event, zooming in, comparing them to typical pregnancy progression photos, and the questions just kept coming. But get this, it's not just the size that had people doing double takes. The color of that belly was several shades darker than the rest of her skin. And listen, when skin stretches during pregnancy, it gets lighter, not darker. That's just basic biology. Your skin is stretching, it's thinning out in those areas, so it naturally becomes paler compared to the rest of your body. So why would her stomach be noticeably browner than her arms, her face, her legs?
Why is the belly several shades browner than anywhere else? It's not supposed to be.
It doesn't make sense. Folks began examining every detail, comparing them side by side with other shots from the same event, and the more you look at it, the more questions start piling up. Some folks online were asking if it was just the lighting or maybe the dress or the angle of the photo, but then more pictures surfaced from different angles, different lighting situations, and that color difference? Still there. It became this thing where once you notice it, it's hard to ignore. And it wasn't just random internet commenters either. People who'd been through pregnancies themselves were chiming in, saying they'd never seen anything like that during their own experiences. Here's where it gets even stranger. Meghan refused to use the hospital that royals traditionally use for births. She also refused to work with the normal medical staff that handles these things. Now, you could argue, that's a personal choice, right? Maybe she wanted privacy, maybe she had her own preferences, maybe she just didn't want to follow the same path everyone else in the family had taken. Fair enough. People make their own decisions about their healthcare all the time, and that's completely valid. But when you combine that decision with everything else that's not quite lining up, The size discrepancy at Albert Hall, the color situation, the general weirdness surrounding the whole thing, it starts to feel like part of a bigger picture. It's not just one choice in isolation. It's one choice stacked on top of a bunch of visual oddities that people were already questioning. And then there's the whole timing situation around Archie's birth. Nobody could seem to track when things actually happened. The announcements didn't match up with the usual protocol. The details were fuzzy at best. Trying to piece together a clear timeline became this impossible task that had people pulling their hair out. You'd think something as straightforward as when was the baby born would have a clear, simple answer. But it didn't. The information kept shifting, the official statements felt vague, and the whole thing just added another layer of confusion to what should have been a pretty standard royal birth announcement. It wasn't just one odd detail, it was layer after layer of things that made people question what they were seeing. And once you start noticing one thing, you can't help but notice everything else. The photos that don't quite look right, the medical choices that break from tradition, the timeline that nobody can pin down.
She's clearly doing this because she's trying to prove to the mainstream media, because now they're starting to talk about this whole...
All of it together creates this picture that just feels off. And that's exactly why people couldn't stop talking about it. Now, here's where things get really interesting. The pregnancy story itself kept changing depending on which interview you happen to be watching. I'm not talking about small details either. I'm talking about the entire tone and narrative shifting from one appearance to the next. It's like watching someone tell the same story at different parties, except each time the story gets a completely different ending. One day, she'd be talking about this glowing motherhood experience. You know, the whole avocado toast vibe, morning smoothies, feeling the baby kick, all that cheerful stuff you'd expect from someone excited about becoming a mom. She'd be playful, cracking jokes about late night cravings, painting this picture-perfect image of pregnancy bliss. And honestly, that version sounded pretty normal, relatable even. But then you'd catch another interview, maybe just a few weeks or months later, and suddenly it was this tragic ordeal that nobody could possibly understand. The tone would flip completely. Now we're hearing about emotional turmoil, fear, struggles that allegedly changed her forever. Same pregnancy, same time frame, but somehow it transformed from sunshine and yoga mats to something dark and heavy. And that shift, it didn't happen gradually. It was jarring. Here's where Tom Bower comes into play, and this is what makes his approach so fascinating. He doesn't show up with accusations or dramatic claims. He just lays out what she said and when she said it. That's it. He puts the interview side by side, shows you the dates, and lets you watch the story evolve or contradict itself right in front of your eyes. It's like he's handing you the puzzle pieces and saying, "Here, you figure it out." And when you actually look at those pieces lined up chronologically, the inconsistencies start jumping out at you. The cheerful account doesn't quite mesh with the traumatic one. The timeline gets blurry. Details that should stay consistent somehow morph into something different. It's not that she's telling completely different stories. It's more like she's remixing the same events to fit whatever mood or message she's going for at that particular moment. Like, people who followed this closely started noticing patterns. On one platform, she'd emphasize the joy and excitement. On another, she'd lean heavy into the struggle and pain. It wasn't just about sharing her experience anymore. It felt curated.
Is that a real baby bump, or has she strapped it on?
Because really weird.
She's got form for strapping.
Like each retelling was designed to resonate with a specific audience or generate a particular reaction. Sympathy here, admiration there, relatability over here, inspiration over there. What's even wilder, the story of how she and Harry first met became this whole thing too. Bower pointed out the whole thing was pretty much made up, if we're being honest. The details kept shifting there too. Who introduced them? Where they met, how it all went down, none of it stayed consistent. For something that should be a pretty straightforward, this is how we met story, it sure had a lot of different versions floating around. What makes this whole situation so wild is that we're not talking about memories from decades ago where details might naturally get fuzzy. These are relatively recent events, told and retold within short time frames. Your pregnancy story shouldn't need major revisions every few months. The basic facts should stay the same, even if your perspective on them changes. But that's not what happened here. The narrative kept evolving, adapting, shifting to match whatever image was being presented at the time. Early Meghan, the relatable California girl finding her way in royal life. Later, Meghan, the misunderstood figure facing insurmountable challenges. Each version of the pregnancy story seemed tailored to reinforce whichever persona was taking center stage. Power's genius move was recognizing that he didn't need to call any of this out directly. He just had to document it, show the progression, let people see how the story bent and twisted and reformed itself. Because once you see that pattern laid out clearly, you start wondering, which version actually reflects what happened? Or is what actually happened buried somewhere under all these different retellings? Let's talk about the timeline, because this is where even the most casual observers started pulling out notepads and highlighters. Trying to follow the dates and events surrounding Meghan's pregnancy announcements is like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces keep changing shape. Nothing lines up the way it should. The dates surrounding her announcements, her public appearances, and the supposed due dates just don't fit together cleanly. You'd think tracking a pregnancy timeline would be straightforward. There's a pretty standard 9-month window, right? But somehow, with this situation, that basic math started getting fuzzy. People noticed that the timeline she was presenting...
Oh, Ms. Markle, you ain't fooling anyone. We just know that you're listening. Yes, that's right. On this new...
didn't quite match up with what the palace calendar was showing. In one account, she'd be talking about nesting and preparing the nursery during a period that, according to official records, didn't really align with where she should have been in the pregnancy. Then there'd be another interview where she's describing early pregnancy symptoms. But wait, wasn't she supposed to be further along by then based on what she said last month? It's like the dates had this flexibility to them, bending just enough to match whatever story was being told at that moment. Online communities went absolutely wild with this. People who normally wouldn't think twice about celebrity pregnancies suddenly turned into amateur detectives. They started creating literal detective boards online, circling headlines, pulling up photos with timestamps, comparing official palace statements with interview quotes. Spreadsheets were made, timelines were charted, and the more people dug into it, the less sense it made. You'd see someone post a photo from an event with the date clearly visible, and next to it, they'd put what Meghan had said about how far along she was at that time. And the two just wouldn't match. Not by a little bit either. We are talking discrepancies of weeks, sometimes months. How do you explain being noticeably showing at an event when, according to your own timeline, you should barely have a bump yet? The thing is, pregnancy timelines aren't really subjective. There are medical milestones, developmental stages, physical changes that happen on a pretty predictable schedule. Sure, every pregnancy is different, and every woman carries differently. But the basic progression, that's biology. You can't be in your first trimester and your third trimester simultaneously, no matter how you frame the story. What made this even more confusing was that sometimes the contradictions came from Meghan herself. She'd mention specific time frames in one interview, then reference completely different dates in another. It wasn't just public speculation causing the confusion. The source material itself kept shifting. People weren't making stuff up or reading too much into vague statements. They were literally watching the stated facts change. Tom Bauer doing what he does best. Notice these soft overlaps. That's what he called them. Soft. The dates weren't exactly wrong, they were just flexible. They'd bend to fit the narrative of the moment. Need to emphasize how early in the pregnancy you were when something happened? The timeline shifts one way.
In the hospital room, apparently getting ready to give labor to this child, Lily.
Need to show how far along you were to make another point. It shifts the other direction. For someone who's followed royal protocols and timelines for years, Bauer recognized that this kind of date shifting doesn't usually happen with royal pregnancies. There are announcements, official statements, scheduled appearances, everything documented and time-stamped. But somehow, despite all that documentation, or maybe because of it, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. What really got people talking was when they'd compare photos from events that were close together date-wise. She'd look dramatically different in terms of pregnancy progression, even though only a week or two had passed. Either she was experiencing the fastest developing pregnancy in history, or something about the visual representation wasn't matching up with the stated timeline. And here's the kicker. When you point out these timeline issues, there's no good answer that makes everything fit. You can't explain away weeks of discrepancy with, oh, I misremembered. Pregnancy is pretty memorable. The dates matter. And when they don't cooperate, when the calendar refuses to make sense, no matter how you try to organize it, that's when credibility starts getting questioned. All right, so if the timeline stuff made you raise an eyebrow, the medical details are going to make you lean all the way forward in your seat. Because the hospital stories, they changed just as dramatically as everything else, maybe even more so. There's this first version of events where the whole delivery experience sounds almost glamorous. She's talking about staying calm, having these lighthearted moments, keeping things chill. There's even mentions of grabbing fast food at some point around the whole ordeal. You know, the kind of birth story that sounds manageable, maybe even kind of fun in a weird way. Nothing too intense, nothing particularly dramatic. Just a woman having a baby, keeping her spirits up, handling it like a champ. But then, in later interviews, that same event transformed into something completely different. Now we're hearing about danger and distress, medical urgency, complications that made everything scary and touch and go. The calm, almost breezy delivery story got replaced with this narrative of barely making it through. Same birth, same baby, but suddenly it's being described like a medical emergency rather than the smooth experience she talked about before. And listen, childbirth is unpredictable.
Born baby for disabilities on orders from the Queen, due to the royal family's shocking hidden history of children with abnormality.
Complications can happen. Emotions run high. Maybe your perspective on what happened changes once you've had time to process it all. That's totally understandable and happens to lots of people. But we're not talking about subtle shifts in perspective here. We're talking about complete opposite descriptions of the same event. Then there's this claim that really got medical professionals scratching their heads. The story goes that she left the hospital within an hour of giving birth. Now think about that for a second. An hour. For a pregnancy that was classified as high risk, she wasn't exactly in her 20s anymore, which automatically puts you in a different category medically. And apparently there were epidurals involved. 2 of them, according to some accounts. Here's why that's wild. Doctors don't just let you bounce out of the hospital that fast after major medical interventions. Epidurals affect your nerves. They need to make sure everything's working properly before you leave. They've got to check for nerve damage, make sure you can feel your legs, confirm there's no complications from the procedure itself. That's standard medical protocol, not optional. It's got nothing to do with being cautious or overly careful. It's just basic healthcare practice. No doctor on earth would sign off on someone leaving within an hour after a high-risk delivery with epidural complications that need monitoring. Your body needs time to recover from that level of intervention. They need to observe you, make sure your vitals are stable, check on the baby, run through all the standard postpartum procedures. You don't just deliver a baby with medical assistance and walk out like you're leaving a dentist appointment. And then there's the whole thing about the weight. She claimed to have gained 65 pounds during pregnancy. Okay, weight gain during pregnancy is normal and varies for everyone. But here's what had people confused. In all the photos, all the appearances, where did those 65 pounds actually go? Her arms stayed tiny. Her face looked the same. Her legs showed no noticeable change. Even her bust didn't seem different. If you gain 65 pounds, it's got to go somewhere, right? That's not an insignificant amount. Most women who gain that much weight during pregnancy show it in multiple areas. Face gets rounder, arms get bigger, legs swell up, everything expands because that's how bodies work. But looking at her photos throughout the pregnancy, all that alleged weight seemed concentrated exclusively.
She's the one who caused it. Her and Harry wanted to play games with her pregnancy. And because of that,
in the belly. Just the belly. Nowhere else. People who've been pregnant themselves started chiming in about how unusual that would be. When you're carrying that much extra weight, especially in your third trimester, movement gets harder. You're not gracefully crouching down in heels. You're not moving around easily like nothing's changed. Your balance is off. Your center of gravity is completely different. Your body's working overtime just to keep you upright. Yet there are photos and videos of her moving in ways that seemed, let's say, surprisingly agile for someone supposedly carrying that much pregnancy weight. Bending easily, wearing those 5-inch heels, moving quickly without the typical pregnancy waddle. It just didn't match up with the physical reality of being that far along while carrying 65 extra pounds. What's really fascinating is watching how the emotional framing of this whole pregnancy journey kept transforming. We're not just talking about facts changing anymore. We're talking about the entire emotional tone doing a complete 180 depending on when and where she was talking about it. In the earlier interviews, you'd see this yoga-loving, lighthearted version of Meghan. She'd be talking about pregnancy like any excited mom-to-be would. Relatable stuff, you know? The kind of casual, down-to-earth vibe where she's just another person going through this universal experience. She'd laugh about cravings, talk about preparing the nursery, share these sweet little moments that made her seem approachable and real. Nothing heavy, nothing dramatic. Just a woman excited about becoming a mother. Fast forward a bit and suddenly that whole tone evaporated. Now we're getting this fragile, barely surviving version of events. The same pregnancy that used to be described with joy and excitement became this narrative of trauma and struggle. She wasn't the glowing mom-to-be anymore. Now she was someone who'd been through something so difficult that it fundamentally changed her. The lightness disappeared, replaced with this heavy, somber energy that felt worlds away from those earlier accounts. And here's what really stands out. Each emotional angle seemed perfectly designed to hit a specific audience. When she needed to be relatable, boom, there's the casual yoga mom who shops at farmers markets and wears comfy clothes around the house. When she needed sympathy, suddenly it's all about the pain and the barely making it through.
Comfortable. I don't think, because she's done this before for photos, I don't think that is a real baby bump. I think
when she needed to seem strong, the narrative shifted to overcoming impossible odds. It's like watching someone adjust their story to match whatever reaction they're hoping to get. Tom Bauer picked up on this pattern immediately. He noticed how emotion became this strategic tool, almost like a dial that could be turned up or down depending on the situation. One year, she's being presented as the symbol of modern, effortless motherhood. The next, she's the misunderstood figure fighting battles nobody else could handle. Each version invited a totally different response from people watching. Now, there were also some pretty wild rumors floating around that added whole new layers to this situation. Stories surfaced about pharmaceutical company connections, though the details on that stayed pretty vague and murky. The kind of whispers that make you raise your eyebrows, but don't really have clear sources backing them up. Still, those rumors became part of the larger conversation people were having about inconsistencies they were noticing. Then there's what Trevor, her ex-husband, allegedly put out there. According to what circulated online, he'd mentioned something about a hysterectomy being a major issue in their relationship. Now, if that's accurate, and that's a big if, because we're talking about claims made during what was probably not the friendliest of breakups, it would raise some serious questions about the pregnancy timeline and everything that came after. But again, this falls into that category of things people were discussing and speculating about rather than confirmed facts. What you can't ignore, though, is the sheer number of times the emotional narrative got repackaged. It wasn't a natural evolution where someone's perspective deepens over time. It felt more calculated than that. Like each platform got its own customized version of the story, each designed to maximize whatever emotional impact would work best there. The early Meghan, who talked about being barefoot at home in sweats during lockdown, just living that normal parent life, that version resonated with regular folks who saw themselves in that image. The later Meghan describing deep trauma and life-changing struggles, that version pulled at heartstrings and generated protective instincts in supporters. Both can't really be completely accurate simultaneously, but both got presented as authentic experiences. Bauer's whole thing was showing how this emotional shape-shifting happened without making direct accusations.
The gross disrespect to the intimacy and privacy of marriage and childbirth. You know, there are some...
He'd just lay out the progression. Here's what she said then, here's what she said later. Notice anything? And when you see it mapped out like that, the pattern becomes undeniable. The pregnancy story wasn't just being told, it was being performed, with different emotional notes hit depending on the audience in the room. What makes it all even more complicated is that we're dealing with real human experiences here. Pregnancy, childbirth, becoming a parent, these are genuinely emotional, complicated things. But somewhere in all these shifting narratives, it became really hard to figure out what actually happened versus what got added for emotional effect. Sometimes what someone doesn't say ends up being way more interesting than what they do say. And with Meghan's pregnancy story, the gaps and omissions became almost as talked about as the actual details she shared. For every emotional deep dive into trauma and struggle, there'd be these basic logistics that just got skipped. Like she'd spend 20 minutes in an interview talking about her emotional state, her feelings, her inner journey through pregnancy. But then simple questions about timing or medical details or just straightforward facts, those would get redirected with a smile or glossed over or answered so vaguely that you'd finish listening and realize you still didn't actually know anything concrete. It's the classic selective transparency move. Share enough to seem open and vulnerable, but keep the details fuzzy enough that nobody can really pin down specifics. And listen, everyone has a right to privacy, especially around medical stuff and personal experiences. That's completely valid. But when you're actively choosing to make your pregnancy a public talking point across multiple platforms and interviews, people naturally expect some consistency in the story. The thing about those gaps is they don't feel accidental. They feel strategic. When you dive deep into emotional territory but skip over the logistics, that's a choice. When you share intimate feelings but leave timelines blurry, that's intentional. It's like showing someone a puzzle but keeping half the pieces in your pocket. You're controlling what picture they can actually put together. Tom Bauer noticed this pattern of narrative restraint, as he called it. He picked up on how certain details would get emphasized, while others got conveniently left out.
And then the belly is seemingly gone as she leaves.
Andy, I've never had my pregnant belly drop down to my knees, ever.
Not in an obvious way. It's not like she'd refuse to answer questions directly. It was more subtle than that. She'd answer, but the answer wouldn't actually contain the information people were asking for. Or she'd share something emotional that sounded revealing, but didn't really reveal anything factual at all. Online communities started tracking these omissions, just like they tracked the contradictions. They'd note when she'd talk around a question instead of answering it, when she'd shift from specific dates to general timeframes, when she'd redirect a straightforward inquiry into an emotional story that, while moving, didn't actually address what was being asked. And here's the interesting part. Those silences and redirections generated way more speculation than straight answers ever would have. When you leave gaps, people fill them in themselves. Human nature, right? We see a mystery, we want to solve it. We notice something missing, we start wondering why it's missing. So by being selectively transparent, she actually created more curiosity and discussion than if she'd just been straightforward from the start. Some people interpreted these omissions as protecting her privacy. Fair interpretation. Others saw it as strategic storytelling, sharing what serves the narrative while keeping back anything that might contradict it. Also, fair. Either way, the result was the same. More questions, more speculation, more people trying to piece together what wasn't being said. Bauer pointed out that in royal life, where everything typically gets documented and verified and officially announced, these kinds of information gaps are unusual. Royal pregnancies usually follow a pretty standard protocol. Announcements happen on specific schedules. Details get confirmed through official channels. The timeline gets clearly established. But somehow, despite being part of that system, Meghan's pregnancy managed to maintain this fog of uncertainty around basic facts. What made it even more noticeable was the contrast. She'd be incredibly open about emotions, feelings, personal struggles, things that are inherently subjective and can't really be verified. But facts, dates, medical details, those stayed fuzzy. It's almost like the verifiable stuff got protected while the unverifiable emotional content got shared freely. And that's where
what that does internally is probably really damaging. Is that I never thought that this would be easy.
Bauer's observation about silence being its own kind of statement really lands. In storytelling, what you choose not to say can be just as powerful as what you do say. Maybe more powerful, because it lets the audience imagine and speculate and fill in blanks with their own theories. Whether that's intentional or not doesn't really matter. The effect is the same. The gaps in Meghan's pregnancy narrative became conversation starters in themselves. Not because people are nosy or invasive, but because when you make something public but keep it partially hidden, you're basically inviting curiosity. You're creating a mystery while simultaneously acting like everything's transparent. And that contradiction, that's what keeps people talking, questioning, and trying to figure out what's actually true. All right, so when you step back and look at this whole thing from a wider angle, what you're really seeing isn't just about pregnancy at all. It's about how stories get shaped, reshaped, and adapted to serve different purposes at different times. Tom Bauer's big observation wasn't that Meghan was lying outright. It was that her stories don't just evolve naturally. They adapt. They morph to fit whatever purpose they need to serve in that particular moment. Needs sympathy during a scandal? The story gets reframed to emphasize struggle and pain, facing backlash. Suddenly, the same events get repositioned to highlight strength and resilience. It's the same core material getting remixed with different emotional flavors, depending on what reaction she's going for. Think about it. One version of the pregnancy story paints her as this relatable, down-to-earth person just trying to navigate motherhood. That version connects with regular people who see their own experiences reflected back. Another version positions her as someone who barely survived an ordeal that changed her forever. That version generates protective instincts and sympathy. Both versions can't be completely accurate at the same time, but both got presented as authentic at different times. This isn't necessarily about dishonesty in the traditional sense. It's more like performance instinct. The ability to take real experiences and frame them in whatever way creates maximum impact for the audience you're addressing. Some people have that skill naturally. They know how to tell a story.
Mum, and never has been. Just when the difficult Duchess wanted all the talk of her fake baby bumps.
How to emphasize certain details, how to create emotional resonance. And Meghan, she's clearly got that ability in spades. But here's where it gets tricky. When you're constantly adapting your story for impact, people start questioning which version reflects what actually happened versus which version reflects the image you want to project. It's like watching someone play different characters, all based on the same person, but each highlighting different traits depending on the scene. The physical stuff added another whole layer to this. There were moments captured on camera that had people genuinely confused about basic physics. Pregnant women who are carrying significant weight, especially in their third trimester, move differently. Their balance changes. Their mobility gets limited. Simple movements become harder. That's not opinion, that's biomechanics. Yet there's footage of her crouching down smoothly, moving quickly, bending in ways that seemed surprisingly easy for someone supposedly that far along. People who've actually been heavily pregnant would watch those clips and go, wait, how? Because when you're carrying that much extra weight in front of you, your body just doesn't move like that. Your center of gravity is completely off. You can't gracefully squat in heels when you're 8 months pregnant. It's physically improbable. And then there's the bigger picture implication that people whispered about. If the children had been born through surrogacy or any alternative method, there'd be questions about their place in the line of succession. Not political questions, just family protocol ones. The royal family has specific rules about lineage and succession that have been in place forever. Whether those rules are fair or modern is a separate debate, but they exist. Now, Bauer never came out and said, "This is what happened." That's not his style. Instead, he'd point out patterns. He'd note that someone who takes individual incidents and weaves them together into different narratives, depending on the audience. That's a recognizable pattern. Some call it storytelling, others call it something else. The behavior itself is what matters, not what you label it. The pattern shows someone who's incredibly skilled at narrative control. Every retelling serves a purpose. Every emotional emphasis hits a specific note. Every gap in the story invites curiosity, while maintaining deniability. It's sophisticated communication strategy, whether it's conscious or instinctive.
Child support and pay my rent. Your opinion is irrelevant because I'm a baby mama. I can do what I want.
What Bauer really exposed wasn't secrets or scandals. He exposed a method, a way of operating where facts become flexible, where events get reinterpreted to match current needs, where authenticity and performance blur until they're basically indistinguishable. That's the real revelation, not what happened during the pregnancy, but how the story of what happened kept changing shape to fit whatever purpose it needed to serve. And once you see that pattern clearly, it sticks with you. Every new interview, every statement, every carefully crafted response, you start recognizing the adaptation happening in real time. The story never settles because settling would mean losing control of the narrative. And if there's one thing this whole saga demonstrates, It's that maintaining control of the narrative is the whole point. So here's where we land after going through all of this. What started as Tom Bower quietly documenting inconsistencies in pregnancy timelines turned into this massive global conversation that's still going strong. The story stopped being just about Meghan or her pregnancy. It became this phenomenon that took on a life of its own. Once Bower's observations hit the public sphere, they spread like wildfire. YouTube channels picked it up, podcasts dissected it, social media threads went dozens of comments deep with people sharing their own observations and theories. Every clip, every quote, every "did you notice this?" post added fuel to a fire that shows no signs of burning out anytime soon. And here's what's wild about the whole thing. People aren't even really arguing about facts anymore. The conversation shifted from what actually happened to what feels accurate. You've got one group looking at all these inconsistencies and going, yeah, something's definitely not right here. Then you've got another group saying it's all just clever editing, taking things out of context, making mountains out of molehills. Both sides are absolutely convinced they're seeing things clearly. That's the power of this whole saga. It's not about definitive answers or smoking guns. It's about perception, about patterns, about whether you believe what you're being told or whether you trust your own observations when things don't quite line up. And that's a much more complicated question than just, did this happen or not? Bower himself probably knew this would happen.
So when Meghan came along into the scene, I just thought, this is fascinating. How is this going to play out? To tell the truth, I spoke to very few.
He never tried to control the narrative once it got out there. He didn't have to. The observations spoke for themselves and people ran with them in every direction imaginable. The noise just kept growing. And with every upload, every new video, every fresh analysis, his message stayed alive and relevant. It's self-perpetuating at this point. What used to be driven by official palace statements and carefully managed PR now thrives on speculation and individual perception. In that chaos, Meghan's story transformed yet again, not through her own words this time, but through everyone else's obsession with trying to decode them. The internet turned her pregnancy narrative into a puzzle that thousands of people are still trying to solve. It's this perfect loop. Meghan shares something. Analysts like Bower break it down, pointing out where things don't match up. The internet interprets it, debates it, dissects it from every possible angle. Then Meghan says something new or stays silent, and the whole cycle starts over. No resolution, no closure, just this perpetual state of curiosity wrapped up in royal drama and contradictory timelines. The fascinating part is that even when Meghan goes quiet, that silence somehow echoes even louder. Because by now, people have learned to read into the gaps. They've learned to notice what's not being said. Every interview that doesn't address certain questions, every appearance that skips over specific details, it all just adds more layers to the mystery instead of clearing anything up. And that's really the genius of how this whole thing unfolded. In the digital age, a mystery doesn't actually need to get solved to stay relevant. It just needs to stay alive. As long as people are curious, as long as there are unanswered questions, as long as new observations keep surfacing, the conversation continues. Meghan's story doesn't have an ending because it keeps changing form. Every new interview brings a fresh angle. Every selective detail shared invites more scrutiny. Every well-timed silence generates more speculation. The narrative is fluid, constantly adapting, never quite settling into one definitive version that everyone can agree on. What Tom Bower exposed wasn't just inconsistencies in a pregnancy story. He exposed a cycle, one where emotion replaces concrete facts, where attention becomes more valuable than accountability.
You know, the whole construction of her father, that man who in the end was abandoned by Meghan for months.
Where the ability to control narrative beats out straightforward communication. And whether you see that as manipulation or just masterful communication, one thing's undeniable. You can't stop watching. The story refuses to fade because every answer just breeds more questions. Every explanation leaves something unexplained. Every version of events contradicts some other version that came before. And in that constant state of uncertainty, people stay engaged, stay curious, stay watching. That's Meghan's real skill showing through. Whether intentional or not, she's created a narrative that never resolves. It just evolves, adapts, and keeps people talking. And as long as that cycle keeps spinning, as long as the questions outnumber the answers, this story isn't going anywhere. It'll just keep changing shape, forever staying one step ahead of any final conclusion. So, what do you think? After seeing all these timeline issues, the changing stories, the medical claims that don't add up, are we looking at honest mistakes or something more calculated? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where you land on this. And if this video had you doing double takes and going back to check details, hit that like button and subscribe. We dive into stuff like this all the time, the stories that make you question everything you thought you knew. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.